I should have done a Friday Reads, but I did not. I ended up going out that evening, so I wasn't around to film Friday Reads. And then I thought about doing a Saturday Reads, or a Sunday Reads, or a Monday Reads, and I didn't. So we can either call this a Tuesday Reads, or we can just call it a Recent Reads. I have no idea what I'm going to title it yet, but the point is I'm here to sit down and drink a little bit of a lemon tea and talk about what I read in the last almost week and a half and what I'm picking up and reading now. If you saw my last Friday Reads, you might recall that I had hauled a bunch of classic French authors that I had picked up from the library. And I told you I was going to sit down and read the first volume of the journals of André Gide. And I did. So this is his journals from 1889 to 1913. They started out pretty good. It was interesting to read his kind of adolescent thoughts, his thoughts as he was reaching adulthood, in early adulthood. This takes you up to about his 40s, I believe, and it does fall off a little bit there. It's not the most exciting journals I've ever read, but they are quite interesting, and I think as I get into the wartime years, the First World War, there'll be some interesting stuff to come across. I started in making some notes in this lovely notebook that I got as a Secret Santa Christmas gift. And one of the things I was doing was beginning a list titled Authors Read by Gide in Volume 1. And eventually I gave up because he likes to mention who he's reading, what he's reading, and I find that absolutely fascinating. That's one of the things that I love about reading the memoirs of Simone de Beauvoir. She talks about who she's reading, what she thinks about what she's reading. And as I came into these journals by Gide, I started a second list as well, in addition to the authors he's read. But I titled it Notes for Better Journaling. I keep a journal myself. I've been fairly consistent since the beginning of 2018. I'll show you my journal. It's just over here. Excuse me for popping off screen for a moment. Look, you can look at my lovely mug while I reach over here and get my journal. This is my journal. I walked into a Chapters one day in 2014 and saw this on the shelf and couldn't find a price on it, but took it to cash and bought it on impulse buy. I was a little bit shocked and disappointed with myself when I realized that the price was in the back and that it was $49. But it was a good investment because I began this on January 6th of 2015 and I'm still at it. That tells you just how sporadic my journaling has been over the last 3 years. But I started journaling every day, with the exception of 2 or 3 days that I've missed. I actually forgot to write yesterday. I've written every day, and so this is what I've filled, this portion, since the start of the year. But it's partly like a therapeutic exercise, a way to relax, but also as a form of creating memories, of taking stock. I've kept journals all my life. I can go back and look back and say, okay, what exactly was I doing on February 13th, 5 years ago? And I can look back, and if I did indeed write on that day, then I know what I was doing. It's also, it helps you work through things, but I also want to make it more of a literary pursuit. I do want to improve my journaling, and so that is the reasoning behind my list. And as I continue to work through André Gide's journals, I hope that I will come across some more tips. He doesn't overtly give tips, of course, but I'm hoping I'll come across a few more tips that I can read in between the lines of his work and draw out and hopefully apply to my own journaling. It's of course something that I would do in the future as I read other people's journals, apart from his and apart from Simone's. But in regards to the long list of authors that he's read, I did eventually give up because there's just too many. You've got everything from Balzac to Stevenson, Dickens, Pascal, Tolstoy, Wilde, Goethe, George Eliot, Isbend, Emerson, Voltaire, Flaubert, and some I don't even recognize because they're French authors and aren't perhaps quite as well known as some of the other French authors. And so I wouldn't have come across them in translation at this point. So that was the first volume that I made my way through, and I think I finished that on a Sunday, and on the Monday, possibly on the Tuesday. Anyway, at some point, I picked up the first volume of In Search of Lost Time, Swann's Way. And this is absolutely exquisite, it's beautiful. It's something that you want to read slowly and savor. Not to say that it's a particularly hard prose to read. I have what some people consider the older and perhaps less literal translation. This is the Moncrief and Kilmartin translation, which I'm told, from a little bit of research I did on the side, is the older translation. And this is the Modern Library Classics edition. I chose this translation solely because it's what was available in English at my library. And I do intend to work my way through the entire novel, the entire set of books, not immediately. As my Francophone co-worker told me, Proust is the kind of author who you don't read all at once. You read one volume and then you take a break and then you come back to it. I was talking to a couple of co-workers and they of course know In Search of Lost Time by the French titles, and so we had a little bit of comparison in terms of titles. Yeah, so I got into that, and then once I finished that, just as a side note, I probably will talk more about In Search of Lost Time eventually. Perhaps once I've read all the books, I don't know, a year or two from now, I'll sit down and film not necessarily a review, but a discussion video talking about my thoughts on those books, or perhaps once I've read. My camera just randomly cut out for a reason I don't know. It wasn't full or anything, it just stopped at 7 minutes and 58 seconds. So let's try this again. I was talking for a good minute and a half before I realized. But I picked up after that The Plague by Albert Camus. And this is something I had begun in December of 2016. So a little over a year ago. I started it on a train, and I think I was fatigued from reading the entirety of Kafka's The Trial, and when I went to pick this up, I was just too tired to get into it. I found the writing clunky, I wasn't interested in the plot, I just couldn't get into it, and so I set it aside. But a couple weeks ago I was rereading the memoirs of Simone de Beauvoir, as I say quite a lot on this channel, and she was talking about Camus' writing, her and Sartre's relationship with Camus, and her feelings when The Plague came out. And she said that it wasn't a good novel. She found the metaphors too overt, too in your face. It wasn't well crafted. And I had this copy kicking around. I grabbed it on a whim yesterday, and boy did I dive into it. One of the best novels I've read this year. Although the metaphor is very overt, the whole plague being a metaphor for wartime Paris, that sort of thing. I think it is well done. There were some passages where I was like, maybe this is a little bit too much, maybe he's using philosophy and metaphor too overtly here. Do we really need this? But it was well enough done elsewhere that I don't think that really mattered too much. I may do an actual review of this one later too. So I read that, and today I started in on Simone de Beauvoir's Adieu, A Farewell to Sartre, which is over here now under my journal. This has been on my shelf for a while. I hadn't gotten around to reading it yet. This kind of picks up where a lot of her other memoirs left off, only the focus is of course on Sartre and his death. It was published after his death, and there's a very, very beautiful foreword in here, written by her, and she's speaking to him knowing full well that he can't hear her. This is the first of my books, the only one no doubt, that you will not have read before it is printed. It is wholly and entirely devoted to you, and you are not affected by it. And she goes on like that, and she begins in 1970. I assume she'll talk about their life together and the last few years of his life, and I'm looking forward to getting into that. Arrived in the mail today as well, my very own copy of All Said and Done by Simone de Beauvoir. I hadn't known this one yet, but I have read it. It is the final volume of her autobiography, it says. So this is volume 4, covering the years 62 to 72. And I'm also going to get into the second volume of André Gide's journals, 1914 to 1927. So we do get the First World War in here, and I'm interested to find out what he was up to during those wartime years. So, that is what I've read, what I'm reading. Yes, that is a thing.